Welcome back, everyone. And if you're new here, my name is Brad, and I'm out here on our 20 acres in North Florida that me and my wife are developing into our future homestead. So if you would, please consider subscribing. Also, for those of you that know our channel, and even those of you new to our channel, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. But today's video is going to be about pole barn versus steel building. We have both types of buildings here on Piney Grove, and I wanted to talk to you today about why we chose each building and what their intended use is for, and also the construction of each building and why one building is designed more for one application and the other one is designed for a different application, and all the thought process that went into that. Now, the first major difference between the two buildings is that the Carolina Carport's mega shed, as we call it, has to be built on concrete. They will come and build it on a level site, whether that's dirt or gravel, but then you'd have a building that isn't anchored to the ground. And there's ways to anchor it to the ground other than a concrete slab. But what that will limit you in is that you wouldn't be able to go back later and pour the concrete slab. And when I show you the inside of the building, that'll make sense. So this whole Carolina Carport's building, and most steel buildings are built this way. You have the red iron buildings out there that used more of the I-beam type construction, but this is the square tubular type of building. But right here we have a 2¼ inch piece of square tubing, and this runs the complete perimeter of the whole building, and that has to attach to something. Now, like I mentioned, that can sit on top of gravel or that can sit on top of dirt as long as it's level, but then you have nothing anchoring your building. And here in Florida, we have a lot of wind lift, so that would be a bad idea for Florida. Now, you could anchor it down with mobile home anchors or things like that, or maybe put some concrete pylons every 3 or 6 feet and then put the building on top of that. But the best way to build this type of building is have your concrete slab first, and then run this square steel, 2¼ inch steel, all the way around the building, and then it's drilled down into the concrete, and concrete anchors hold this to the concrete, and then the rest of the building is built up from there. Now, that's totally different from how this pole barn is built. These are 6x6s, they could be 8x8s, but here in Florida, we don't have a frost line, so we actually take the whole post and put it in the ground. So if this post is 16 foot long or so, let's say, 3 to 4 feet of it's in the ground. But the difference is there's nothing in the ground on the Carolina Carports. This post is put into the ground and you don't need the concrete pad ahead of time. You can actually pour the concrete later. A pole barn doesn't have to be built on flat ground. A pole barn can be built on a slope, and you don't have to ever address that slope. You could use that pole barn as it is on a slope and store your equipment under it. So while we're here, let's also talk about one of the big drawbacks of a pole barn, and that is that this wood here is down in the dirt. Now, it's treated wood, it is encased in concrete down there, and it's down 3 or 4 feet. And there's some rebar that goes through this post so that it's harder to lift up for hurricane force winds here in Florida, or any type of winds, a strong storm. But there still is wood to dirt contact, so you have that to think about and worry about. Whereas in our metal building, we don't have to worry about that at all. There's no wood in that building at all. So while we're in the pole barn and we're talking about wood, we'll talk about these things. And this is a Carpenter Bee Trap. And a big reason why we didn't do both buildings as a pole barn is because of Carpenter bees. They're a big problem here in Florida and probably in the South in general. And these things can completely destroy a building. They burrow up through the bottom side of treated or non-treated wood, and they create cavities in this wood. And in those cavities, they lay their larvae, and they come back year after year and just continue to work their way down until the inside of your board probably has half the strength that it had when it was new, when it was put up. So that's another thing to consider, the fact that carpenter bees will try to destroy your building. While we're talking about wood and carpenter bees, let's also talk about the wood itself. These are called purlins. These purlins stretch between 2 trusses in the pole barn, the black trusses, and they keep them equal distance apart and provide some structural integrity to your building. But they're also flimsy because they're 12 footers, so there's not a lot of rigidity between here because the trusses are 12 feet apart. So inside the metal building, the trusses or the framing is no less than 5 foot for the wind loading of the building. This pole barn is built in Florida, and the wind loading rating is 130 or 140. The Carolina Carport's building is 170 or 190. So it's got a little bit higher wind load rating, and being about 60 miles inland from the coast, that's probably a good rating for this area. So another thing to show on purlins and the way that they're attached to the trusses is that you have this little shelf right here that the purlin lays in, and then you put a couple screws in there, and then they put a screw up top here to hold the top of the purlin from bowing, but that's all that's holding it in there. It's not a lot of strength holding it together. Now when you come up here to the actual rafters that are holding the tin on, you'll see the same thing. You'll see a couple of screws there. All those things together give you rigidity and help in the strength of your pole barn, but not as much as a steel building. So in the pole barn, you saw that the main vertical stability and structural integrity is from those 6x6 posts. And in the steel building, you have these steel vertical, let's call them studs. They go all the way up to the roof line in that case. And over here where the lean is shorter, they go up here to this angle bracket. And you'll notice that all of these are about 4 or 5 feet apart, whereas in the pole barn, those 6x6s are 12 feet apart. So not only are these not wood so they won't twist, because pole barn 6x6s, 8x8s, they're going to twist in the sun eventually as they dry. They're never going to stay perfectly straight, but these will stay perfectly straight. So that's another consideration about a metal building, is that all of the vertical structure, all the vertical studs will be nice and straight to attach your sheet metal to. Okay, so we've covered that metal is straighter than wood, or at least it will retain its straightness over time, whereas wood will not. And we talked about carpenter bees and different types of things like termites that will attack a wood structure building like a pole barn versus a metal building where they won't be a problem. But another big thing about this metal building versus that pole barn is that this building is perfectly square. All of the metal, everything comes pretty much pre-cut and they assemble it on site, and the concrete has to be square within a certain tolerance. When that initial rail is put around the edge of the concrete, everything built up from there is built, and it's easier to maintain its squareness not only when it's built, but over time. Now we've made a lot of cases for a steel building, and again, this is a Carolina carport made by that square steel. There are I-beam type of steel buildings where you can have a lot more span, but in this particular building, which is more affordable than the I-beam building, you can only have so much spanning, and in order to span an area so that you can have free flow here and not a whole bunch of vertical structures in your way, you got to put headers. And the longest header that they have, or at least that they told me, was about 20 foot. So this is a 40-foot long building inside, and we still had to put a vertical post here that's in the way. Now we have plenty of space to move the excavator and the tractor around. In a pole barn, you could have this same width inside here and not have the post here. So that's a big reason why a pole barn is a little bit more versatile for like equipment storage than say a metal building like this. Now I'm sure there is a way that you can free span and not have that post and maybe have a stronger, longer header. But in most cases, this is going to be a limitation. And one thing you can do in a metal building is you can have them build a room within the building, and they use the same steel framing that we've already showed you out there. But then what happens when you want to put stuff on the wall like drywall, OSB, you have to do what we did here, which is run wood framing inside of that. Now we elected to rip down 2x4s to frame this out and get it ready for spray foam, and then we're going to put either OSB or some sort of siding on the inside here. But because it was made out of steel, there were some complexities or some things we had to think about before we could do that. That's a minus on a steel building, because if you wanted the original manufacturer to come in here and put wall studs, metal wall studs a lot closer together, I guess they could do that, but that would be at an increased cost to you. They're going to do what's standard for the wind loading, and we never talked to them about putting extra studs here. But if you look, each one of these studs are part of a rafter system that holds up the tin. So you can't just arbitrarily put a metal stud here. If you did, it would be a non-load bearing stud. And again, it's not something that the installers offer or that they're used to doing. Maybe you could talk them into doing that. But with having wood framed on the inside here, it'll be easier for us to affix the OSB or drywall, because we can use, standard screws that you would use in construction. Another drawback of a metal building is electrical service, and I'll show you what I mean. So we have our electrical panel that comes in here, but in order to get that power throughout the building, you either have to run hard conduit lines, bend it and shape it to the contour of the building, or you have to use that MC cable. and that MC cable is not as flexible as, say, regular wire you would use in wood construction where you can make a 90-angle turn, and it just creates issues, and it can be real unsightly if you don't do it correctly. So a challenge that a steel building gives you when you're trying to build a structure within a structure, and in this case our bathroom, you have to build your 2x4 walls completely in here, and they're independent of the steel. So it just becomes a little bit clumsy and cumbersome to do it this way. It's just harder to build inside of a steel building and attach to that steel. In a pole barn, you can actually attach to the wood on the side of the pole barn, and we'll show you that in a minute. Another thing I'd like to make note of in a steel building is you don't have to have your metal studs every 16 inches, every 24 inches. There's a lot less clutter when it comes to your metal studs. You can span greater distances. This building is rated to 170, 190, but you'll see there's not a lot of verticals holding up this 10-foot door. There's one over here on this side that the track is attached to, and one on that side, and then there's a header across the top, and then they mounted the door to that. This is a hurricane wind load door, so that metal and all that has been engineered so that with minimal amount of support in vertical structures and horizontal structures, that it will support this door when there's 140, 150 mile wind pushing against that. In a pole barn, you got to frame that completely different. Not only is there no wood rot or carpenter bees to worry about, but also it's a cleaner look. It's just a lot cleaner on this wall and the back wall with those minimum vertical studs that are holding on the sheet metal. Okay, we spent a lot of time in the metal building, but let's be fair to the pole barn. So this is the biggest thing about a pole barn, all of this free span right in here. There's nothing in the way to maneuver around so that you can get your tractors in here, your lawnmowers, your boats, your trailers, whatever. And this is only 32 foot wide. I don't know what the limit is on trusses. I know you can go 40, maybe you can go 60, but the point is that you can free span all of this space. You don't need to bring any sort of vertical structure here like we had to do inside of the shed at the 20-foot mark. I mentioned earlier on is that you can build the pole barn on any sort of slope and you don't have to level it at first, and you can level it later or level parts of it later if you want to build it out. You can build a pole barn without any concrete and use it, and then later on, if you decide you want to upgrade it, or maybe you're doing it incrementally because of financial concerns, you could then concrete it or concrete parts of it, or you could later put in the footers like we did. With a steel building, if those two verticals were coming down right here, they just could not be on gravel. They would be too unsteady. They would have to be anchored into something, so you'd have to pre-plan that. So you get a lot of versatility with a pole barn as far as you can put it up and start using it, and then maybe work your way into how you're going to use it, 5-10 years later. You see this loft behind me, and you could build that in that metal building, and it would be similar. You'd have to run your walls out. But the hard part would be how it ties into the outer wall. When you have 6x6s, wood 6x6s like this, it allows you something to tie into. Whereas if we did that in the steel building, you'd have to have some sort of metal brackets to screw into the steel. I'm not saying that you couldn't do it, and I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be a little bit more difficult to do in the steel building versus doing out here in the pole barn. So this is what I mean about the outer wall is integrated with the outer wall of a pole barn, whereas on the steel building, it would have to be built completely inside. So here's a 6x6 here behind these 2x4s, and there's a 6x6 behind this 2x6. This is the outer wall of the building, and we ran a 2x6 sill plate along the bottom, and we have our 2x6 studs. But in a metal building, this would be metal to this point right here, and then you would build this inside of that. So you would essentially have a double wall. This is integrated into the actual 6x6. So this wall is actually nailed into the 6x6s. It gives those 6x6s extra structural integrity and rigidity, and it's just becomes all part of one and monolithic. Whereas inside the steel building, with that wall being inside of the steel wall, it would be a freestanding structure. And one thing I mentioned in the steel building was the use of that 2 1/4 framing, and there was minimal use of it. It was every 4 to 5 feet and just had a really, really clean look. You'll notice in here, this is built on 16-inch centers. So these 2x6s are on 16-inch centers. Then you have your king studs, your jack studs, your cripples, all that for a window. In the steel building, you have a metal vertical here, a metal vertical there, one horizontal, and mount your window, you don't have all this extra framing to frame in a window. And it's just as strong. In fact, like I've mentioned several times in this video, that building is actually stronger than this building wind loaded. Now this pole barn was wind loaded at 130, 140 per engineering drawings. It has not been re-engineered or recalculated what the wind load would be of this particular structure within the pole barn. Maybe it could be as high as the shed over there, we just don't know. But it did take a lot more effort to build this wall and put in these windows than it did on that metal building. So we talked about the framing in the metal building. You can see how much framing was needed for this wood door. We had to build a special header to hold it up. Had to do that on both sides, of course. So another example that we talked about in the steel building, we had minimal framing for the roll-up door. Well, here's a roll-up door that's the same size as the small roll-up door of the steel building, but it required a lot more framing, and it's wood framing. And then after the wood framing, it required some tin to be bent to protect this wood. And then, of course, you've got your J-channel and your tin on the outside. All that is for aesthetics and durability. You don't want to have to paint wood here because this is a 2x6 or a 2x8 behind here. But every one of these areas is potential for water to come in and get behind here and rot this wood. It can't do that on the steel building. Even if water does come around those front doors of that steel building, it's not going to rot those vertical studs. And I also upgraded the vertical studs on that steel building. I went from, the standard gauge steel to a higher grade steel, and it's all galvanized. So that's definitely, longevity. If you can keep this sealed and keep this wood dry, it'll last just as long as that steel, but you're going to fight it, and you're going to have a lot more maintenance items than the steel building, at least in the door areas. But one thing that came into our mind and was a decision point was these are going to be stalls along here. Goat stalls, donkey stalls, whatever my wife Deb decides that she's going to put in this barn. And I think she probably needs 3 barns for what she has in mind. But if we go every 8 to 10 feet and we create these animal stalls, animals like to eat and they like to poop and pee, right? So they're going to be in here at night. They're going to be in here during inclement weather. So there's going to be a lot of that type of stuff going on, and especially urine. And what I was concerned about, and what I have seen in farm buildings throughout my life, I grew up on a farm, was where urine, high in acid and nitrogen, I guess, it contacts galvanized metal. Eventually it breaks down that galvanized metal. So if we did this building like we did the mega shed, and we had that metal runner along the bottom, I was concerned that might rot out over time if it's continually wet, damp, and has, animal feces or urine against it. Now it's galvanized, but it's not galvanized where it's cut. It's electroplating and it's very corrosion resistant, but I think that animal urine would break that down. And if you were to lose that bottom rail, which is your main structure of a metal building, it'll be really hard to replace that. But probably the biggest reason to have a pole barn in lieu of a metal building, or one for one application versus the other, is just the pure flexibility of it. A steel building is all one shot. You set that up, you set up the concrete, you set up the steel building, you pay them and they come build it, and then that's it. That's the building you have. There's less flexibility there, and it's really hard, if not impossible, to do things incrementally over a long period of time with a metal building versus a pole barn. So I mentioned that free span capability of a pole barn versus the mega shed behind me, and I talked about those metal verticals that have to come down, not only in the center of the pole barn, but you can see on the shed back there on the porch, we have 2 2¼ inch metal vertical studs or brackets or columns, whatever you want to call them, that come down to meet the concrete, and that's what would need to go right here. With these 6x6 posts in lieu of metal, these are in the ground and they're self-supporting. I don't have to figure out where my concrete would go here, put a footer here to hold up those metal verticals. I can put this post here and figure all that out later. Now, as I went through the process there, I felt like maybe I was selling the steel building over the pole barn, but that was not my intention. My intention was to show the different pros and cons of each building, and you can see that we obviously went with one of each because this steel building didn't work for what we wanted in our animal building, the red barn, the red pole barn behind us. And then a pole barn wouldn't have worked for us in what we're going to use the mega shed or the steel building, the clay colored building over here. So that's what I wanted to get across. There's a lot of considerations. I think you could make either building work in either application. So for our situation, the mega shed turned out perfectly. On the pole barn, it started out with just the standard pole barn, 32 by 60, with a 16 by 48 lean. And then we leveled the dirt in it, and then we put in the footings, and then we built the workshop here on the end and put the windows in it. And now we're going to figure out what we're going to do inside for our animal stalls. So the pole barn really worked out for us. We can use it in the meantime until we get it to its end state. Now you'll notice I didn't talk about cost in this video. That's because the mega shed was built 2 years ago and it's 2022 now, and this pole barn was a whole different pricing than it was 2 years ago. Everything is expensive, tin is expensive, trusses are expensive, the 6x6s, everything about both buildings are much more expensive in 2022 than they were just 2 years ago. I think financially or cost-wise, the buildings are going to be close to equal, but that's going to be very regional specific. There just could be a multitude of reasons why my building might be cheaper than yours, or vice versa, my building's more expensive than yours. So that's why I didn't cover cost here. This isn't about cost. This is about longevity of the building. This is about configuration. So hopefully this video gave you some things to think about. Would love to hear your comments and below. We are not geniuses here. This is just what we did out here in Piney Grove. We've never built a Carolina carport before. We've never built a pole barn before. And these are the ideas that Deb and I came together and got us to the state we're in. And we'll continue to document it as we do more to both of these buildings. But like I said, leave a comment below. Tell us, your ideas about buildings. If it doesn't change what we do, it may help another viewer out there that's watching this video, and they see your comment, and it may help them out. So hopefully you enjoyed today's video, coming along with me out here on Piney Grove, looking at our buildings and talking about them. So if you would, click that like button, that's that thumb at the bottom. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share with your friends. Otherwise, we'll catch you on the next one. Take care out there, y'all.